installation person for upland restoration projects. She assists on research projects, monitors and surveys vegetation in Central Florida, performs rare plant surveys, and assists and advises on horticultural operations. So she really knows her stuff. And now I'll turn this over to Nancy. She can share her screen.
There it is. Thank you. Ready to go?
Ready to go.
Okay. I liked your introductory screen with all the grasses and sedges on it. Oh dear. She said that I know a lot about these plants. Well, I learn about them probably the way you do, one at a time, and I've just been at it a long time. The monitoring really helped with that. So the introduction, there are actually 4 grass and grass-like families. The first, grasses, is probably at least the second largest family in the world. Probably asters are first. There are 463 species in Florida and over 10,000 worldwide. Rushes is a much smaller group, only a couple of genera and only a few species in Florida. And sedges are actually quite widespread and numerous in Florida as well. But there is a 4th family that probably many of you have never heard of because it only occurs in the southern half of our world. South Africa is a real hot spot for them, but they also occur in South America and Australia. So the picture on the right is actually one of the many varied and beautiful forms of restios. So it's always a big question of how do you tell these families apart? Well, all of them are monocots. The grasses are in the Poaceae family. They're characterized by having narrow blades, leaves that sheathe the stems, jointed stems, and a distinctive and somewhat complicated flowering system. Rushes are distinguished by cylindrical stalks or hollow stem-like leaves. And sedges characteristically have solid 3-sided stems, but not always do sedges have edges. Leaves arranged in 3 rows and spikelets of inconspicuous flowers. But the spikelets themselves can be quite interesting. So just to emphasize that they don't always follow the rules, this is actually a rush, Juncus repens, that is found often on the floors of cypress bulbs. And when I was monitoring and first saw this, I think it took us most of the monitoring season to finally figure out what it was. But this is what the basal parts look like, and it can even float in the water. Grasses, sedges, and rushes are found in many of our ecosystems. Wet prairies are especially diverse with many sedges, some rushes, and grasses, but sedges really star in this community. And flatwoods have a wide variety of mostly grasses, and perhaps the dominant one is the wiregrass. But it gives that community stability and allows it to burn, as does dry prairie. This picture was taken in Central Florida, and it was actually a flatwoods to begin with, but the trees were timbered off, and so this is what remains. But dry prairies are essentially flatwoods without trees, and they do occur naturally in some areas of Central Florida. Sandhills are higher communities, more well, a little bit sparser. Again, wiregrass is a dominant. And all of these communities are really appreciated too for the diversity of wildflowers. Sometimes you get an expanse of just a single species. This is a cutthroat grass seep in Central Florida. I like to show pictures like this because it shows how grasses can even be used as a substitute perhaps for a pond or a lake. It gives that smooth aspect to a landscape, smooth, continuous. So we're going to start one of the bigger grass families, the bluestems, broom sedges, or old man's beard, which, in case you haven't heard, comes from andro, meaning man, and pogon, meaning beard. I said there are 21 forms and presently listed because recently this particular genus has undergone a really large change in naming, and this can be a little hard to keep up with. There also can be quite difficult to tell apart. But there are some distinctive ones. One of my favorites, short spike bluestem, Andropogon brachystaceus. The short spike is actually because these spikes with the florets are fairly short compared to some of the other andropogons. But I would rather call it tall willowy because that really describes what you see. The base has very stiff upright leaves and is very bright green. So even without the flowering stems, it can be quite attractive. And here's the flowering stem. You capture that willowy feel. The chalky bluestem has become a favorite in landscaping. It likes moist, sandy soil, ideally. The whole plant can be chalky, not only just the flowering part, but the leaves as well. Anthropogen Capillaries is an old name that is now the new name again. On the left, you see how we can just brighten up a landscape with that bright, silvery, chalky leaves. And on the right is how they're often grown in nurseries, in tubulings. Another one that we used to call big chalky bluestem has been kind of common, renamed as purple bluestem, Andropogon cretaceous. It's called purple because the base leaves sometimes have a little purplish cast to them. Now it's quite a bit taller, larger than the chalky bluestem, and it's not a very fussy plant. It just likes some moist soil. And again, here it is in a natural setting. Contrast that with this seeded area that has not only chalky bluestem, but also the rayless sunflower, Helianthus radula, and you can see some goldenrod and blazing stars in there too. Splitbeard bluestem, Andropogon ternarius, is in sandhills and flatwoods. It's called splitbeard because of this, but you see the little golden anthers on there? It's hard to get a picture of the split in the beard because as soon as it splits open, the seeds are ready to drop. And that mostly looks like what you see on the left. And here's some pictures of the close-ups of the stems and flowers where you grasp that bright red and green look to the, we sometimes call it the Christmas grass as well. Some of the other andropogons have this, but not to this extent. So now I'm going to talk about a couple of them that can be a little bit troublesome. They're too easy to grow, too easy to occupy an area and reseed. And so a few in the landscape might be a big problem. The big picture actually is a Bahia grass field, but this broom sedge or old field variant of broom sedge has occupied a good part of it. So when we were working on the Bach Tower, wet prairie, and bog, we were having trouble growing some of the beak sedges. And so we actually harvested little clumps from an existing wet prairie that was quite pristine. We did this in a very careful manner, of course, with the permission of the owners. But the seed bank, the seeds buried in those little clumps of dirt, had the old field variant of Bluestem. And so when these plants grew out, they popped up everywhere, and we had to go in and cut them back and eventually remove them from the landscape so it wouldn't completely take it over. Another Andropogon that can do this is this bushy bluestem, which you often see along ditches as you're driving around in the fall, which is an indication again that it's more of a pioneering species and can occupy areas early. This is the bushy bluestem Andropogon glomeratus variety pumilus, and it's quite beautiful. It's just that you have to be aware that it can take over. So now we'll move on to the Threon family, the Aristidas, which you may think of as basically wiregrass, which we'll come to. But this is Aristotle Gyranz, and it is found in really dry, scrubby soils. I included it here because it too is a good reseeder. And if you're doing something like the restoration we're doing on this site, it will reseed over time and help occupy the area so there's no room for things like natal grass that we don't want. Another one with somewhat of the same character is this bottlebrush Threon, Aristotle spiciformis. If you are taking walks in the fall, especially in Florida's flatwoods type areas along the edges of the paths, you may see this plant because it does have a little bit of a pioneering character, and it will pop up where there's been a little disturbance. But I really like this picture on the bottom where there's a whole big field of it. And I thought, you know, this might be something that could be really useful in trying to get an area naturalized initially. Now, wiregrass, Aristotle stricta. Perhaps the one you're most familiar with if you know a bit of Florida, because it is such an important species for those communities I had just shown you. It's called Threon, and here you can see the awns spreading out from the stem. There are 3 on each seed. And the picture below is taken from one of our restoration sites, an early one, after the site was burned, about 4 or 5 years after it was seeded. And you can see how the plants have bloomed. Toothache grass is found in wet prairies. It's really neat because of that little pigtail, I call it, of bloom stalk and blooms where the seeds occur, but also known by chewing on the leaves at the base of the plant, and it numbs your mouth just a wee bit. There aren't many grasses that do well in shade, but some of the witch grasses do. This is called variable witch grass. We used to call it Great Dane grass. We did grow it for a while. There wasn't much interest, but I see that it is now available in at least one other nursery or even by seed. And another one that can occur in the shade of live oaks which I have seen again naturally occurring, is another dicanthelium, Porterosense. This one is more attractive. The other one is an easier colonizer. Since we've introduced the love grasses, you may be more familiar with these. You may either love us or hate us for doing it, because there is a little bit of an issue when the seed stems break off and tumble across the landscape. This one, Elliott's love grass, usually has this bluish cast to it. It doesn't necessarily have to, but most of them are. And on the lower picture, you see it in bloom. Here at Bach Tower, it's scattered through the sandhill plantings. And in the fall, it's more visible. This was in the Flatwoods area. The other love grass we introduce is the purple love grass. I'm going to go back just a moment to emphasize this one factor about Elliott's. It's a very versatile grass because it actually can grow all the way from scrub soils down into being flooded for, I'm not sure how long, even a month or two, the base flooded. So it can go from very dry to very, very moist or hydrate. Purple love grass isn't quite as variable that way. It likes dry, well-drained soils. And this is how it looks in the fall. It's called purple love grass for the bloom haze, but it's not quite as purplish as you would think of Mooley grass being. In the fall, looking from the other direction and it's backlit, you get a different view of it as opposed to this picture. These were taken on the same day. It was just a difference in the angle of the sun. All of these, the love grasses and the bluestems, combined with silver-leaved aster, can give a lot of color and texture to a landscape. Mooley grass, this one I know everybody has seen, and it's very easy to fall in love with this plant. It's beautiful when it's not in bloom, and it's just outstanding when it is. So Mooley grass and wiregrass both have wiry leaves. Mooley grass is much larger, but there's sometimes, especially when they're seedlings, they're a little harder to tell apart, but they can by this, see the arrow? This ligule is quite tall, comparatively speaking, for a grass. A lot of the characters of identifying grasses come down to very tiny measurements. So this can actually be 2 millimeters tall, whereas in wiregrass, you really don't see it. But wiregrass has a tuft of hairs at the very base of where the leaves join the stem. And if you look closely at that, you can see this tuft of hairs. This picture was taken at Archbold Biological Station in the parking lot. And here you have Mooley, and closer to the walk is the purple lovegrass. This is a natural field of Mooley grass near Kissimmee Prairie Preserve. And at Bach Tower, along the little stream that separates the wetland. Another name change. When I give this kind of talk about restoration and grasses to some people, they say, oh no, we can't do that. But many of the panicums have been changed to Coleotaenia anceps. There are many panicums, and some of them have been changed in this way. This one is called Beaked Panicum. It has a panicum-like bloom, but a real identifying character, if nothing else, is the roots have this very scaly appearance. And here it is planted at the entrance to the visitor center at Archbold. I thought it would be perfect here because it does like a fair shade. And you often find it in just that kind of position in a natural landscape as well as out in the open. Unfortunately, here it did not have enough water and did not persist. Maiden cane is another grass that many people are familiar with, but it's not often used in a home landscape setting. It could, however, especially if you live near a lake. This picture was taken at Disney Wilderness Preserve, and almost the entire landscape you see was initially covered by torpedo grass. The torpedo grass was removed and the area was sprigged with maiden cane, and it is done quite well in that setting. There is another maiden cane called blue maiden cane, which has a darker green leaf. You can see it a little bit there. But if you hold it up next to the light, you can see this white edge, which is a real distinguishing factor for it. At the, not only, let's see, just at the wetland area where the water from the pond was pumped up and it was cleaned through this area, there were slopes here and around the edge of the boardwalk that we needed to plant with something that would hold the slope as well as take that intermediate moisture level. And so we sprigged in this blue maiden cane. Back. So this blue maiden cane likes to go somewhere along seepage areas, especially between higher, drier, and moisture levels. And the other maiden cane, its name has changed to Haimanaki. That maiden cane actually is listed as an obligate or a very wetland species, but it can actually grow all the way up into scrub and sandhill. There's a place in Lake County. I'm sorry, I can't remember the name of the preserve, but you can see it quite often in the upland parts there. Okay, two more panicums. I added these because they are more wetland species. Panicum longifolium, not so much. It's more of a seepage slope, but it's a really good species for repairing spots in wetlands. You can almost hand toss the seed. And Panicum longifolium actually has fairly attractive leaves and could also be used near edges. The giant plume grass has a particular majesty. It's 6 to 8 feet tall, I would say. You can even cut it when it's in this stage before it is totally fluffed out and put it in vases. And the picture on the right is actually from one of my bouquets I've had in my house for a number of years. Lopsided Indian grass, that's the October special. Lopsided Indian grass blooms in the middle of October, depends on the area, early to mid, and the seed will only stay on the stalks for about a week to 10 days. So it has to, when we're collecting seed, we have to do this early. But such a striking grass in bloom. Here you see close-ups in bloom, and it's those long awns that hang down and away from the stem that give it the name lopsided. These pictures are still in bloom. You can see the yellow anthers hanging down. And a few more pictures. from seeded areas. The lower one is actually from Archbold Biological Station. There are several cord grasses or spiralis. And you actually, I'm sure, have seen this. Actually, it occurs most often when you're coming down from flatwoods where there's saw palmetto and so on, and then when it drops down below that, you come to the sand cordgrass wet prairie. At Bach Tower, we used it along the boardwalk. You can see how large it is, especially in comparing it to the giant fern here. So you have to consider the spread of this grass when you're planting it out. Give it room, 3 to 5 feet, 4 feet might be about ideal. And still you will get a full cover. So the next two cord grasses, salt marsh and with smooth and salt meadow cord grasses, the two species are intermingled here. This was taken up in north of Steenhatchee. And you can also see some of the black rush in the background. These were called Spartinas. Their names have been changed to Spiroblis. This one is smooth cord grass, occurs on saltwater beaches, tidal marshes, and flats. And this one is called salt meadow cord grass, grows even up into the beach dunes and also down into brackish and salty marshes. So they sort of interconnect. But here you can see the smooth cord grass on the left is just in a little wetter habitat than where in this restoration the salt meadow cord grass is being planted. This is a required restoration site, restoring where I think it was a battery plant existed at one time. Another grass I'm sure you've seen, Tripsicum dactyloides, Pakahatchee grass, very large, robust clump. Even though it's called Pakahatchee grass, this grass grows all the way to the middle of our country. And it's especially beautiful in bloom. We don't often get a chance to observe those tiny little details. The other interesting thing is this is the seed. You see how it's kind of stacked up in a row? This is one of those grasses that, like corn, was a earlier form of grasses. And sea oats, this is our last grass. I thought it was a fitting one to end up with. Probably the only time you may be interested in this is if you actually, for landscaping, is if you live near the coast. But it's a beautiful way to spend on the beach and move on to the next category. So did you want to put the question in at this point, or should I move on? Okay, I'll move on. So I've neglected my last couple of times I presented this is to include the benefits to wildlife. And there are many. There are actually some butterflies like the skipper that grasses are a larval plant food for. And small birds like the Florida grasshopper sparrow actually will feed on those tiny seeds of even Andropogons. The Florida grasshopper sparrow is a highly endangered bird species that they have now. The Florida wildlife has begun raising in captivity and reintroducing to the wild because the numbers were so low. Moving on to the rush family. And we'll just talk about two of them, but two that are fairly common. The soft rush is actually a worldwide species, the entire world. It occurs naturally. I see in the picture on the right, it's actually called a subspecies here. And these were planted in that little stream between the wetland and the pond at Bok Tower. The other one is black needle rush, which in this picture is quite black. If you are traveling north of Florida through Georgia on I-75, you cross those great big areas of black needle rush that are so impressive. This picture was actually taken near Steenhatchee, so we have it too. This was taken actually in the same area, and here you see a band of really bright green grass. That's probably one of the Sproblus that I showed you earlier. And here it is in a restoration planting again. However, I would really be cautious about where you would use this in a landscape because it's called needle rush for a reason. The tips are so sharp they could definitely poke you, and be cautious about eye pokes especially. This is called giant bulrush, but we're not in the rush family anymore. We are now in the sedges. And like I've said before, sedges don't always have edges. The giant bulrush, here called Californicus, you sometimes see planted in a little deeper water out from the very edge around lakes and ponds. And it doesn't there form a thick stem like you see on the left. It's much more, looks much more open and quite tall. Here's another Eleochorus, another spike rush, again, a sedge. And this one is, again, often used in restoration. The way I chose the plants to discuss in this program was which ones were available commercially. And so even though some of these have been used mostly in restoration, and they certainly could be used in the home landscape or business as well, this is how they have been most frequently used in the past. White top sedge, however, is a little more petite plant, and it's those showy white bracts that make it attractive. This one is only a little over a foot, 12 inches. And here is the giant white top sedge. And it's about 2 feet tall, and the white bracts are very noticeable. Early on, we planted this in the wet prairie at Bok Tower Gardens, and it was so showy all summer long. I don't know why, but it had not persisted real well. I don't know if it's short-lived, or even though we planted it in a fairly moist area, it may not have been moist enough. When I thought Grandma was asked to please talk about the Carex genus, and we hadn't really used Carex much in Florida, but it's so widely used in other parts of our country. Here we're collecting seed from the Carex that we're seeding on a restoration site nearby. And since it was a while ago, I'm not positive the idea, but I think it's Carex varicosa or warty sedge. It's just one of 70 that are native species in Florida, mostly on wet soils. If you are driving in the off-road, or I guess in country, dirt-covered roads only, often in the moisture spots especially, you see this very low, flat ground cover. And it's called road grass for that reason. But it's actually a small sedge with very fine, wiry stems. and the stems will lean over and root again, so it does spread as well. I have to tell the story a little bit. When we were doing the restoration and planting the landscape at Archbold Biological Station, part of the area used to be a tennis court, and Dr. Hilary Swain thought it would be nice to still have that opportunity when this particular area that was supposed to be sort of the wetland catchment when there was a lot of rain wasn't too wet in the winter months, and they could actually play tennis on it. But again, where we got the source of this seed, we were absolutely amazed at the amount of other plants that were stored by seed in the seed bank and came up. So where can you find these plants? Here's a beautiful wet prairie and citrus or pitcher plant bog in North Florida. But a good share of the grass-like vegetation is actually one of the many beak sedges, Rhynchospora species. Rhynchospora microcephala and Rhynchospora chapmanii and many others we also planted in the wet prairie bog at Bog Tower. Bog gardens are awfully fun to create, even in a home landscape. Here's bog garden and wet prairie planting at Bog Tower, where we use many of these beak sedges. And here they are seeded in a wet prairie in Pasco County. There's the head right there, very tiny. And in a wet prairie down in Hendry County for the Florida Wildlife Commission. So simple techniques, which you all know just from, I think most of you are avid gardeners, but for these plants, typically do not enrich the soil. If you think your plant needs a little kick, put the fertilizer in the bottom. Tip the containers out rather than pulling them. Sometimes these plants do not have real sturdy root masses. Dig oversized hole, and we always hand tuck. Of course, the way nature manages these landscapes, these grass-covered, I call them savannas if they have some trees, is by burning. And the burns used to occur naturally when we didn't have roads and other things to interrupt the landscape once it caught fire by a lightning. So now much of the burning happens on a managed scale. And here we're burning our seeded landscape. And this is what it looks like after the burn, where you can see the wiregrass and other things starting to bloom. So how can you do this in a place where you certainly don't want to burn? This was a wildfire and grass planting, wildflower meadow, where you have the walking pathway, a strip of bahia, and then the wildflowers and grasses. And here you see the difference that a mowing at particular times of the year can make. And we usually stress mowing at about 8 inches. It can be a little shorter, but don't scalp the ground, especially for clump grasses. And it'll extend the weed, it'll reduce the weedy look and will extend the flowering period. I would say one of the key times might be the middle of summer, say late July, maybe early August, and that will still give a chance for these clump grasses to send up blooms in the winter, but might knock back things that you don't want to go to seed. Another way to manage them would be to rake out the dead grasses with a garden rake. Grasses don't need to be tended to all the time. They are perfectly fine as they are. If you do wish to neaten them up, if you're getting too much duff at the base, this is one way you can handle it. If you do need to cut them back, we suggest cutting them quite low, just a couple inches tall. If you have traveled the Greenway around Orlando, for example, you see that they often cut grass about a foot plus tall, and it looks very, very unnatural. Here are some pictures of various sites we have done, and what they look like often in the fall. This was scrubby flatwoods. This is a planted flatwoods, a small area at Bach Tower. A seeded wiregrass at Reedy Creek. This was a mitigation bank. The planted sandhill at Bach Tower. This was probably later summer. And here it is in the fall. The neat thing about these landscapes is they change so much through the seasons, and you get a chance to notice plants at different stages. And planted grasses and wildflowers. Seeded sandhill. Another seeded sandhill in the middle of the green swamp. And for the same site, actually. Here are children playing in the plantings at Archbold Biological Station. And that is the last slide. Thank you so much for listening. I do want to give a shout out to the many photographers who helped by contributing pictures, and to both the Florida Wildflower Foundation and the Florida Association of Native Nurseries to help it to gather these pictures and help put this on. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much. I am going to launch this poll because I couldn't get my act together earlier.
I don't know if I didn't stop at the right point or what, so I just kept going.
We figure everyone knows and likes Mooley Grass, but based on this, answer the question, what other types of grasses piqued your interest? Okay, I'm going to end the polling. It looks like Bluestem's 50%.
Oh, good.
Love grass is 38%, and lopsided Indian grass 56%. So most people are interested in the lopsided Indian grass, which is pretty tall but pretty spectacular when it's blooming.
I'll have to add a little note there. Lopsided Indian grass, when we're collecting the seed or working with the seed, we find we get itchy in the soft spots like our crook of our elbow or around our neck. And it's an irritation that goes away when you wash. But the people who work with it put scarves around their neck, etc., so it doesn't irritate. It's a minor problem. It's beautiful grass, isn't it?
I'm going to launch another poll real quick just to see if everyone was paying attention in the beginning. Which genera mostly have cylindrical stems?
All right. One question I thought of asking, but I knew it was too close to the beginning, but I was going to say, how many grass and grass-like families are there?
So that's,
All
can
right.
you see those polling results?
Mm-hmm.
So did everyone get the right answer?
Oh, yeah, brushes. And if
Okay.
you look hard enough, you could say that probably all three do it, one species or another. Yeah.
Yeah. Let's go on to the Q&A. So first question, what grasses would you suggest for erosion control at a canal edge?
So probably the one that would be the fastest growing and will fill out covering the area. First one that popped into my mind would be the maiden cane, Panicum hematomum. But yeah, I guess it depends on how fast erosion might happen, because even things like cordgrass, the Spartina bakeri, I don't have the current name. I'm not quite up on that. But because it's such a massive plant and has a heavy cover, it would, but it would need time to grow out. So sometimes that's a factor that is difficult to realize when you need erosion control right away. So first choice, probably maiden cane.
Okay. Second question is the Fakahatchee grass in our neighborhood and adjacent areas turns brown, starting at the tips. The landscape crew then cuts it down to about 18 inches and the new growth starts out okay, but then browns out after a month or two. Do you know what's going on wrong?
I have to say, I don't know. I've never seen it. I think asking your local agent with the agriculture department might be the best way to go to find an answer to that. And the thought that they cut it back to 18 inches gives me the shivers. It must not look very nice.
Next question, what's the irrigation schedule for new plantings? So how?
Well, that's variable. Irrigation schedule. Guess it depends on the soil type, time of year, etc. But I would water sufficiently to keep the mass of soil where the roots are moist. And when we're planting in natural areas, we usually don't have the restoration areas. We usually don't have that option of a wide scale irrigation system. So we very closely monitor this soil moisture, and then we'll hand water as needed. That to me is kind of ideal. I just would not overwater, even in the beginning. I would think if you water the plants in when they're planted, even every other day initially, and then start loosening up, and that depends on the time of year. My one caution is that you have to remember, especially in Central Florida, our harshest time of the year are the spring months, April, May, before the summer rains start. So if you are planting then, you need to be extra careful with your irrigation. Sorry, it's not a specific water 30 minutes for every day, etc. But you can't do it that.
An observation, those of us allergic to grasses have to limit what we plant. Are there any grasses that don't prompt allergic reaction, people who are normally allergic?
Trying to think of what grasses, of course, it's the pollen that
Yeah,
the grasses produce that are irritating. And a good share of our native grasses are fall bloomers. So it might be a matter of restricting bloom growth at that time of year by mowing or whatever, cutting back. And because they're mainly fall bloomers, it's not like lawn grass that's going to bloom over and over again.
Do rushes and sedges have the same pollen issues?
Probably. They're all basically wind pollinated, yes. And whenever a plant is wind pollinated, which is why goldenrods really aren't a culprit, but it's more things like ragweed and therefore the grasses and grass lakes that spread their pollen by the wind. They produce a lot of pollen, and it's usually fairly light so the wind can carry it. And that's where the problems occur.
Okay, and another member asks, lopsided Indian grass flourished in the western exposure of my sandhill yard only for 2 years. What's the secret to having it return? My other grasses continue to provide beauty and habitat for years.
I think lopsided Indian grass is not a real long-lived plant, but it certainly should live longer than 2 years. In fact, lopsided Indian grass, if it's in a natural landscape, when it's burned, it doesn't bloom that year. It doesn't bloom till the year after. And the heavy blooms usually are from like year 2 to year 5. And I don't have real good knowledge of how long they normally last. I would definitely be careful of over fertilizing, perhaps. Overwatering shouldn't be too much of a problem, making sure that it's planted at the right depth. And one way to help with, grasses are crowns. They start the upward portion right at the base, and the roots go down from there. And so overplanting could be a big issue. I'm not saying that you don't know how to plant, however, you probably do, but just be really cautious of that. And mulching.
So it doesn't like mulch?
No, any of these clump grasses, you want to be careful not to mulch over, because the leaves spread out over the ground. You don't want to mulch over part of the crown. Want to lift it up and not stack heavy mulch right around the base of the plant.
Okay.
Just like you do for a while.
Yeah, that's an interesting thing I hadn't thought about. Another question, what would you suggest for erosion control on the dry lower edges of a property sloped, of a sloped property near a street? So erosion control, dry lower edges of a slope property.
So usually dry in Florida means fairly sandy, deep sandy. And I don't think quick erosion is quite as much of a problem there. And I would go with some of these clump grasses like wiregrass, love grasses, and so on. Yeah. Or even a combination of those. It would take a little while to grow out. The love grasses grow out much more quickly than the wiregrass, but I think it would make a nice combination planting.
Okay. Question, does Muley grass ever reseed itself in the home landscape? I've had them for years, but they do not seem to reseed.
We did some seeding out. Actually, it was for a golf course complex on old restored land. And we were asked to seed wiregrass around a planting of Mooley Grass. And when we went out there to look, I thought, oh my goodness, the wiregrass is really coming up. But it wasn't, it was the Mooley Grass. And the reason it did, I know why the wiregrass didn't, but the reason the Mooley Grass did so well is because they had irrigated so frequently. And I think that's the difference. If you make sure, if you want to collect the seed, you have to make sure that the flowering stems are no longer purplish. That's the easiest way to tell. I always look at it under the microscope, but if you pick the seed while it's still purplish, the seed isn't ripe. And so that could be a factor, but it sounds like you're just talking about reseeding within the landscape. And it could be not continuous moisture, which it would take to germinate.
Okay. Another member commented, much success with digging up and dividing. I'm assuming that's the clumps.
Yep, you can always do that with, yeah, you can do that with most of these clump grasses. Of course, if you're in production like we are, that's fairly expensive way to do it. Seeding for us is much easier and quicker. But division, yes, you can do that.
Okay. And then somebody else asks, are there any grasses more easily propagated by an amateur when they gather their homegrown plants, making more Muley grass, for instance? So which grasses are the most easily propagated?
Propagated.
Yeah.
Love grasses are definitely easy. Wiregrass takes a long to germinate, so you have to keep that soil moist at the surface for a longer period of time. Lopsided Indian grass is actually quite easy. And what's neat about it is when you put the seed on the soil, and if the soil is moist, you usually cover it a little lightly. If the soil is moist, or when you moisten it, you can see the whole seed mass start to wrinkle and twist and turn. It looks like it's alive. It's because those awns are twisting, and that's one of the mechanisms that used naturally to bury itself.
Interesting. I have another question. My love grass, the spikes with the seeds on them break off, and it's like I have tumbleweeds all over my property. Is that the
Mhm.
way they spread their seeds?
It most definitely is. And I usually put plants, and grasses are a good example, into categories. There are some plants that are just weedy. They're usually annual. And then there are the pioneering species that take hold fairly quickly in a disturbed area. And so that's the next category. Now, when I talked about the Andropogons, the old field variant of Andropogon virginicus, and the one that you see in the ditches, those are pioneering species, and so that's what they're designed to do. They reseed rather readily. Now I can't remember what the question was, so I hope I am.
Oh, I was asking about the tumbleweeds and we were
Yes.
asking about propagation
Okay,
in
right.
general.
So love grasses kind of belong in a little bit in that pioneering group as well. Yeah. That's how they spread their seed, and their seeds are very tiny. If you actually rub the the seed area, you get down to this very, very tiny little seed. So it can just lie on the surface and germinate. Doesn't need to be covered.
Okay, and the last question, are there grasses that have properties that keep other plants from growing around them, such as chemical defenses?
No, I'm not aware of any of the grasses that do that. Of course, you sometimes think some of these weedy grasses like Kogan grass are so aggressive, but that's not how they operate. They just spread by rhizomes and also germinate from seed rather readily. So it's more robust growth, like those two weedy andropogons I talked about, and Kogan grass, and
And
natal grass in drier soils. Yeah,
so they just sort of crowd out other plants?
correct.